Hello, everyone. Kotzer here speaking once again. Doing a little bit of a different intro this time around to see how things are, but I figured it's time to drop a review of Dragon Ball GT, or in this case, a reflection of Dragon Ball GT in this matter. Because if you haven't heard, Dragon Ball Daima, the ever so popular Dragon Ball Daima that's currently airing right now, is about to end sometime tomorrow, and once I get my hands on this final episode, I'm pretty much going to review it, drop my full thoughts on it, and give my overall score, I guess. But before I do that, I feel like it's only fair that I talk about Dragon Ball GT because a lot of the show's themes and whatnot is kind of tied into GT, which I will get into. I mean, the pretty obvious one's pretty apparent the from where it's being drawn on. But why am I talking about GT now? As this is a show that's about to turn 30, turn coming next year of 2026. Well, the reason being is that again, Dragon Ball GT is a show that has lived in infamy as one of the most divisive shows to ever come out of the Dragon Ball franchise. And like I said, I know there are people out there that love GT, and there's definitely some people out there that absolutely despise and hate GT to the point that people want to forget about it, especially with the more recent anime adaptation, Dragon Ball Super, that came out back in 2015, if I'm not mistaken. And, I think both sides of the argument is justifiable and it makes sense as to why GT has been like the most divisive, most controversial anime to talk about. But I think, in my view, in my personal opinion, I'm gonna be honest with you and say that GT definitely is one of the weaker anime of the franchise as a whole, but I wouldn't say it's the worst. It's definitely not the worst out there now in the whole bunch of Dragon Ball filler and movies that have come out in the wake of GT. Again, I believe in the Dragon Ball Z universe as a whole. There's like 10 plus movies of movies, basically filler movies that's out there that are probably as bad as this. I mean, again, who can forget the trash and really, really awful Bio Broly, which was a really horrible, horrible attempt of trying to revamp the Broly as this new super soldier, but ends up being the weirdest, disgusting thing ever, and it became the most filler episode that you could ever think of. This is still to this day my least favorite Dragon Ball movie to date, and it's no surprise to why. Um, but again, going back to GT, again, since GT has come and gone for me, and I've watched the show multiple times, this show definitely has some high points and some low points that I really want to go over. So, of course, yes, obviously the story being that this is about Goku turning back into a kid after he got Dragon Ball Wish back into a kid, and now it's his quest to originally it would have been the quest to like become an adult again, but of course Daima had to take that storyline. No, in this case, they decided to play around with the fact that okay, he's a kid now, but he can still be pretty powerful, and he's going to unlock some interesting powers and come across really powerful but menacing villains. And what I like about the show is that even though this is like a 64 episode show, and it's not like a huge juggernaut of a freaking huge show like Dragon Ball or even Z was, I would argue that GT at its finest is like kind of compact to like what it should be, just getting to the bare bones of it and just telling you what it is really. And I appreciate that. I do agree that this is the right direction that GT headed at. Now, for one thing, I think I'm just gonna get to the bare bones of things. I love the 90s animation art style that came about with GT when it came out. Prior to this, considering that this did immediately came out after Z ended. On top of that, I do, there are definitely some highlights with the fight sequences being like super good, really kind of holding up to this day. And believe it or not, there are some pretty big menacing villains in the show that are still pretty iconic in my view to this day if you've watched GT. I mean, who can forget the menacing baby, who has been like a pretty main staple of that GT series? And how can we forget the final villain of the show, Omega Shinron, who and all the Black Star Dragon Ball villains, they were pretty menacing to say the least. And they played a pretty big role, like why they are the way they are. And also, how can we forget the classic but amazing and possibly the most underrated transformation of all time, the Super Saiyan 4 transformation, which to this day is definitely one of the most iconic transformations out there in the Dragon Ball franchise. Now, with that being said, there are also low points of the show that I have noticed as the years have progressed on with the show, especially after I watched it multiple times. For starters, while yes, I did compliment earlier that the animation is really good, really retro, really keeping to its time period, there are moments where the animation has aged really badly. Like Dragon Ball Z's animation and the Dragon Ball and the original Dragon Ball from back in the day, its animation and art style qualities are a lot more nicer and cleaner and more forgivable compared to GT. Because to me, there are moments in this show when rewatching this where the animation has fallen off tremendously or it just feels super cheap and bland. And and as a result of it, it just kind of feels like there's like a lack of emphasis and tension when it comes to like the world being at stake, I guess. Another thing that I could probably go on to is like some of the characters of the show aren't that good or just straight up forgettable. Case in point, arguably the first early episodes of Dragon Ball GT were completely forgettable because again, during this first arc of GT, it was essentially Goku, Pan, and Trunks trying to go out across the galaxy to find and collect the Black Star Dragon Balls before the Earth blows up. And some of the villains in this little arc were memorable, were fine, but none of them stood out because again, all of it was building towards the Baby Saga arc, which was a lot more strong, a lot more memorable. Um, Again, without a doubt, we do have some pretty cool characters that came into the mix, but undoubtedly, again, the villains are just super forgettable. Some of the newer heroes that Goku and friends come across were also forgettable, sadly. Some of them only last for like one episode, and we never see them ever again. With the only exception being Omega Shinron from the final arc of Dragon Ball GT being like a pretty big standout. But outside that, nothing really much. And then, I guess I gotta address the massive elephant in the room, the character Pan. Um, this character to this day has also been a really divisive character when she first debuted in GT. And honestly, I'm not surprised by that because like I said, the criticisms towards Pan's character in this show cannot be understated as again, a lot of people didn't like Pan when she first came out because of her boyish super punky attitude and just not giving a fuck more or less. But I think over the years it definitely has aged somewhat well to where I like it. I think it's pretty good. It's okay. I think it's part of Pan's character and the fact that they kind of replicated that from where we last saw her in Dragon Ball Z and eventually re-replicating that in the latest Dragon Ball Super movie that came out not that long ago is commendable. I like it. I think it's pretty good. Um, so again, I think the hate towards Pan, I get it, it's understandable, but I think the hate is a bit much regarding her character, in my opinion. And then we go into like some of the other characters that come into the show that for me is like a massive drop off in quality from what we know of them. For example, um, I know this has become a running meme at this point in the Dragon Ball community, but Gohan, man, what happened to my boy Gohan in GT, man? They reduced him to nothing but a former shell of himself in the GT series, and it's such a shame, man. So much potential, and they wasted him back to where he's back to his Super Saiyan 2 form when he shouldn't be. He should be in the Super Gohan form in this show. Um, Goten and Trunks, they're essentially just background filler. Well, except for Trunks. Trunks plays a pretty big role in the earlier seasons of GT, but then sadly gets reverted back to nothing more than background filler, unfortunately. A lot of the comedy moments in the show do hit. They do are fun and are nice, but they kind of just like take away from the tension and such, to where it's like one moment there's like a comedic moment, next thing's like a serious like world bending moment that's gonna be like, oh no, we gotta take things seriously, and I feel like it wasn't balanced out super well. And furthermore, while Vegeta's Super Saiyan 4 transformation was super good, really iconic, um, as many people point out, again, it is a damn shame that he had to use a machine to get the basically the Blood's Waste machine to become a Super Saiyan 4, which is pretty sad. But for the brief moment that it was available, it was definitely pretty cool, and I really loved the design. But it's just such a shame that again, Vegeta also got power crept tremendously in GT. Like they really massively nerfed him in this show. And to wrap this show up, I guess the ending of GT I thought was pretty cool. It was okay, but it felt pretty. It felt kind of like a nothing burger of an ending. Like you can tell it was kind of rushed for the sake of being rushed, because the ending takes place immediately after they defeat the big bad Omega Shinron. Um, Oh yeah, and ultimately, it pretty much ended to where, all right, the Dragon Balls need to be gone forever, and we're never gonna see them again, and all this other stuff, and it ends in like 50 years into the past, and it's like it doesn't really have a satisfying conclusion. And I think that's about it with GT in a nutshell. Again, I for me personally, I like GT. Originally, yes, admittedly, I was a GT hater when I first watched the show, but over the years, this show has definitely grown on me tremendously, where I actually like it and appreciate it. And yes, do I think the kid version of Goku being in the show and being nerfed so much to where he can't perform his best is annoying? Yes, it's also annoying as hell, and one of the main criticisms that we will get into when I get into Dragon Ball Daima. But ultimately, I think GT was a pretty good show, at least for the most part. It had some really good, strong moments that kept it from not being super bad. And for that reason, I think I'm going to leave it there. I think GT is just an overhated show. And, you know, going into this, I'm definitely going to be talking more in depth into why this show and Dragon Ball Daima is kind of connected to each other. But yeah, I figured I just want to talk about GT and hopefully get something out of it, even if I maybe gish gallop a couple words here and there in this review. But hey, man, I think I'll be talking about it much more clearly when Diamond drops. All right, I'll see you in the next one. Later.